We know that when the police are called upon to enforce policy, the risk of selective enforcement is high. For example, we know that speeding and parking tickets are already disproportionately issued to black and brown men. So what happens when the United States of America is hit with a once-in-a-generation pandemic? And is part of the problem that our society throws more policing on situations where policing is not the answer? We discuss racial disparities in policing during COVID-19 on this episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. Up next. We got to start it off with a New York City welcome. And for those of you who don't know what "yer" means, it is the equivalent of saying hello in the English language. It is how us New Yorkers greet each other when we see one another on the street. It used to be accompanied by a dap, but I don't know if we're dapping anybody up anymore during this time. I think that from now on it's probably going to be a dap from a distance. It honestly wouldn't be me if we didn't start things off with some humor to start off the first episode, right? I mean, it could have been worse. I could have asked you to spell bacon, egg, and cheese, because here in the big city, you have to say it with one mouthful, right? Only one. There are no gaps in bacon, egg, and cheese. So you can imagine yourself in a spelling contest, one of those spelling contests, and you have to spell it together. No gaps, no caps. And what I will say is that the reason why I had to bring this up is because I'm a little bit obsessed with this Netflix movie out that's about spelling bee contest, because I always wondered about those things myself. But really informative documentaries. If you ever get a chance to check it out on Netflix, you definitely should. But anyway, beautiful people, welcome to Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast, and my name is Mike. It has been a really tough pandemic for the entire world. And this is just one of those once-in-a-generation things where years from now, if we last that long, everyone is going to remember where they were when the entire world went on lockdown because of the novel coronavirus. And what we've seen through this pandemic is that it's been a lot more brutal on communities of color. We've seen way more death, and we've seen way more serious illness. And if matters were not already bad from a health perspective, because the healthcare system in the United States is just broken, we have this issue of disproportionate police enforcement on the rules of social distancing, of mask wearing, etc., etc. One of the things that I would have to say really bothered me when I was considering this issue is, why call in the police anyway to enforce public health policy? I mean, think about it. We've already seen that historically the police are not very good at being used to remedy issues involving health. And I'll give you an example. Take mental health. And I'll give you the example of New York City, because that's where I am. Currently, the NYPD responds to mental health crisis 911 calls, right? And for a long time, New York City police officers have been given crisis intervention training, which provides them with de-escalation techniques that they can use while interacting with people in emotional distress. But even with this training, That did not stop over 17 New Yorkers with mental health illnesses to date to be killed or critically injured by the police. So there are a bunch of advocates who are saying that because this isn't working, we need to try something different. The same logic applies here with enforcing public health policy on social distancing measures. I mean, obviously, social distancing is very, very important if you're going to fight a virus. But shouldn't the Department of Health be taking the lead on this? I mean, calling in the police for every public policy is problematic. We've seen what it's done to our schools, our public schools. We've seen what it's done to our mental health and other things of that nature. Trust me, as someone who is the product of the public school system, you are more likely to see police officers roaming the hallways than a school nurse or a school psychologist. And that is just the unfortunate reality. Now, as we saw from that, when we're talking about public school education, we know the school to prison pipeline, that there's an increase in punishment and throwing young black and brown kids in jail rather than educating them. And that's not an opinion. The proof is in the numbers. So we know where the failures are, so we should make an effort to correct them. So on top of the financial devastation that has been tied to COVID-19, now you have the police in some places giving out steep fines of up to $10,000 and even arresting people for violating social distance rules. This is going on while we have record unemployment, little or no relief for rentals and homeowners, and food banks running out of food. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, this is counterintuitive. Think about it. Think about it this way. Increased police contact, as police obviously are essential workers, increases the likelihood for transmission, not just on behalf of the people who the police are serving, but this increases dangers for police. If we're concerned about the police themselves, then we have to be concerned about their increased contact with other people. Let's take New York City, for example. Once again, I'm going to use New York City a lot because I live here and it's the example that I know the best. At least 40 plus police officers from the New York City Police Department have died from COVID, and hundreds have called out sick. That number has probably increased since when I did research in preparation for this episode not too long ago. The novel coronavirus has ravaged the New York City Police Department. And it makes sense. Any job that requires constant interface with the public is going to put you at high risk for this virus. So it's counterintuitive to arrest people for violations of public health. The last thing we want is for people to be in close quarters because that puts everyone at risk. I would argue, and many others are arguing this, and I remember in the beginning this was a big deal, we shouldn't even be sending people to Rikers right now. Because what does it do? It puts our corrections officers at risk too. The more people you put into Rikers from off the street, the more Rikers becomes an incubator, if it isn't already, for the novel coronavirus. The system as it is just not sustainable. And people, we're just going to take a quick break here, and we're going to talk more about it coming up in these next few minutes. Hello, lovely listeners. This is Mike here. It is my hope and desire that you're truly enjoying this podcast. And I want this experience to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question or response to anything that you've heard on this episode or any episode, send me an email at theracewarspodcast@gmail.com. That is the Race Wars with an S podcast@gmail.com. Or send me a DM on my official Instagram account for this podcast and follow us at the_race_wars_podcast. Interact with me also on Facebook at facebook.com/the_race_wars_podcast. Let's talk. I'll be waiting for you. People, I want to take some time to shout out some local businesses and creatives, right? This segment is going to be called Shouting Out Local Businesses and Creatives. Every episode, I'm going to highlight some creatives, some businesses, some people out here who are doing some really special things. And as I stated on my social media, if you're a creative or you're running a business, please let me know. I'd be happy to shout you out on this podcast. The only thing that I ask from you is that you share this podcast with your friends and the people who support your ventures. First, we've got Bianca Love, a wonderful soul who I went to school with many moons ago. I think it was middle school, right? So, she's a life and spiritual coach, a Reiki master, and a healer. You can follow and support her at _Bianca Love on Instagram, _BIANCA Love on Instagram. Next, we've got Nicole Boehner, an old law school colleague of mine. She's a talented lawyer, but she's also a consultant, speaker, and facilitator at Nicole Gabrielle, and the owner and founder of Melanin and Moxie, which is a lifestyle and wellness blog. You can follow her at I am Nicole Gabrielle on IG. That is IAMNICHOLEGABRIELLE on IG. Next, we've got Christian Mendoza, who's the owner of King Collective Stats, Auction and Breaks Facebook page. You can follow him on that page. Finally, we've got, that's not finally, we've got Rianda, another wonderful soul who I grew up with, makes some fantastic Caribbean West Indian food. I can definitely attest how delicious that food is because I've ordered from her, and she makes deliveries primarily in the Rockaways and in Brooklyn, but you can follow her at _Gray's Kitchen on Instagram, _Gray, GRAYS Kitchen on Instagram. And now we're coming up to the home stretch. We've got Katie, who's a jack of all trades, a journalist, a photographer, and runs her own advertising company. You can follow all three of her Instagram handles. First, at RAWZone NYC, that is at RAWRRZONE NYC. Then Katie _photography XO, that is KATIEK _photography XO. And at Ivy Productions, that is IVY Productions. I finally want to shout out Raina Love, who did the fantastic logo that you see on my social media pages for this podcast, based in Boston, and you can follow her at Raina.love, that is at REINA.LOVEE on Instagram. Don't forget the other E. And that's all I have time for on this episode. If I missed anyone, I will definitely shout you out in upcoming episodes because I plan to do this on each and every episode. So don't forget, Follow me, let me know, and I will gladly support you. Now let's get back to our episode. Thank you. All right, we're back now. So as I was saying, we've been talking about disparities in police enforcement. And the question is, what are the disparities in enforcement that we are currently seeing? Well, we're seeing white joggers in Prospect Park being treated very differently from black youth playing alone in parks. There was a New York Times article in May that claims that there were 40 people arrested for social distancing violations. 35 of them were black. That is staggering. 35 of them were black. I'm going to say it again. 35 of them were black out of 40. Even in Toronto, this is not just necessarily a New York City problem. In Toronto, black people are facing a very similar problem. And, you probably thought Canada was free of racism, but let me tell you something. They just market theirs a little better. Black people in Toronto are facing the same dilemma of being perceived as a threat for wearing a mask or for wearing a mask or not wearing one. And that's quite terrifying. Right here in the United States, we have an example of 2 black men who were kicked out of a Walmart for wearing masks. Imagine that. They were followed by police and they were told that they could not wear masks. Very interesting, right? During a pandemic. During a freaking pandemic, bro. Now here's the problem. There is already an existing history in America where black men wearing masks is seen as menacing because there is this fear that they might be part of a gang. And it brings back a personal memory, something that I could think of. When I was in high school, I remember it was a very, very cold day and everyone on the platform was waiting for the train to pull up. And there was always this large police presence at the train station, which I didn't realize until now was totally uncalled for and unnecessary. You're going to have those times in your life where there are things that you've been conditioned to see as normal, and it's not until you get older that you realize, wow, this is not normal at all. But anyway, and I witnessed the police officer rip a face mask off a high school student. Now, in the wintertime, if you're cold and your face is cold, a face mask makes sense. And you should be able to wear one to protect yourself, right? But not if you're black. If you can't wear a hoodie, you definitely can't wear a mask. That's the problem. And going back to this issue of enforcement, using the police as the enforcers of social distancing rules not only puts black people in close proximity to the police due to the discriminatory forces at work, but also because essential workers themselves are disproportionately communities of color. And so they're forced to be in spaces that subject them to widespread police surveillance and harassment. So you got the double whammy there. You've got essential workers are primarily black and brown, and that's going to put them in surveillance with the police because they've got to be out and about. They can't stay home. Unfortunately, what this all adds up to is black lives being sacrificed in the name of white public health through policing. There's no other way to describe it. We didn't have to criminalize, demonize, and punish people. The money that we put in the resources to criminalize people could have been used to fund the black community based organizations to help people follow public health guidance and invest in better conditions for workers. There are so many great community-based organizations out there that could have used the money to spread the word and help the community. And I've interviewed a bunch of these community organizations when I was an undergrad student and I was working on my thesis for community-based organizations in the context of critical race theory. And you find out when you go to the Bronx, when you go to Brooklyn, when you go uptown, there's all these organizations that are really dedicated to the community and really want to do a lot, but they're not getting the resources. So they're doing a pretty good job with what they have, but if we could give them more, then we wouldn't need the police to be out and about with these public health issues, because the community-based organizations could take the lead. Or we could have sent in representatives from the Department of Health to make sure that these desperate communities have access to masks, rather than it being a free-for-all in what it turned out to be. Now, what I know now is that we're a little bit better in terms of making sure that everyone has a mask. I heard that there are vending machines where you can get masks. That's pretty creative. I always thought you could only get soda and candy, but now you can get masks. That's great. Less diabetes for everyone. But we have to do better, and we can do better. So back in April, Senator Kamala Harris of California and a few other members of the Senate Judiciary Committee urged federal law enforcement agencies to provide anti-bias training and guidance to police officers over these same concerns about racially biased policing, because it was inevitable that communities of color were going to be profiled while wearing masks or other face coverings in public. It is a serious problem. If a mask is going to be the new norm in many parts of America going forward, there has to be a way to protect communities of color from the discrimination and abuse that comes from Black people either wearing a mask or not wearing a mask. What I will say, though, is that we've seen some policy changes. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced back in May that police would no longer require people to wear a mask in public unless the absence of a mask presented a serious danger. The police will, however, continue to enforce rules against large gatherings. But the mayor insists on keeping the New York City Police Department as part of the public health enforcement powers. People, this is nothing new. There has been so much focus lately on the Spanish flu with regard to comparing its impact on the United States in comparison to what we are seeing with the novel coronavirus. One thing we should talk about, and I don't know if you've heard much about it, is what Black communities had to go through during the Spanish flu. Now, after all, the Spanish flu of 1918 was going on during the same time as Jim Crow. And you know, during this time, especially if you think about Chicago, Black people who were struck by the Spanish flu had to fend for themselves. I'll give you an example. When the city's Black cemetery in Chicago couldn't hold any more graves, the white sanitation department wouldn't dig graves for Black victims of the Spanish flu. The public health edicts that were established at that time just functioned as another layer of Jim Crow, quarantining Blacks to the ghettos of the south side of Chicago. Disease was stigmatized. It was the public health department that sent nurses to Black homes to find out if you were sick. Public health officials would come to Black homes without their permission to question them about whether they were infected. These were troubling times, just like they are now. Another really interesting thing about those times, and you have to understand, mainstream media did not cover the Black community in the way that they do now in those days. And if they did cover the black community, it was in a way that reinforced negative stereotypes. So, if you wanted news about the black community, you had to read a black newspaper. And that's what a lot of people did. And I want to tell you about one particular African American newspaper that was very important in relating information during the Spanish flu of 1918. That is called the Chicago Defender. If you've never heard of it, look it up. The Chicago Defender. It's an African American newspaper that's been around for a long time. It's still around. And during this time period, there were two things that they reported that reminded me a lot about the issues that we're facing at this moment. First, the Chicago Defender urged the health commissioner to order police to stop putting 25 to 30 prisoners in small, unsanitary cells. And finally, due to the ongoing tension between police and the black community, the Defender said that the police stations were, quote, doing more to breed disease than any other agency supposed to be working for good in the city of Chicago, end quote. So imagine that. No different from today. So that is just one look at what has been going on regarding policing during this pandemic. And we see clearly that we haven't learned very much from the Spanish flu of 1918. What are the answers, though? Like, really? We've spent a little bit of time talking about policing during COVID-19. And I just wonder how many of us are really thinking about how dangerous this mask situation is. I mean, we live in a generation where our community has been protesting heavily due to the outrage and anger over what happened to George Floyd. But it's not just George Floyd. Very frivolous things could put us in a bad situation. And a lot of us are really concerned. We see now, at least from what we know from the mayor's office, that the NYPD is not heavily enforcing social distancing rules the way they were before, from what we know. And honestly, I've been out a bit lately, and there are too many people outside acting as if this whole pandemic is over. And I know quarantine fatigue is a real thing. People are really tired of being home. But if wearing masks is going to be the new norm, can we be certain that communities of color will not be treated badly for wearing a mask or not wearing a mask? Because this certainly is one of those damned if you do and damned if you don't situations. If a black man is threatening because he's wearing a mask, and then a black man is threatening because he's not wearing a mask, where do we go from here? And should police across America continue to enforce issues that are really issues of public health? I mean, think about what we talked about earlier regarding mental health, and I could have gone into so much more detail if not for the sake of time. People, we really need to change where we see values in policing rather than throwing police at the problem, because it's evident that the way things are currently being done is not working. By the way, if you're interested in policing in general, there's a very important book, I would say, required reading rather, if you would like to understand the militarization of police. It's written by a journalist, Radley Balko, and it's entitled The Rise of the Warrior Cop, The Militarization of America's Police Forces. It's a book that came out back in 2013, and I think that's how long it's been in my personal library, actually, since 2013. I've had the book since it came out. So in the wake of all the protests, if you really want to understand why police walk the streets dressed like ground troops in the military with all this armor and gear, it is absolutely required reading. This concludes this episode of Race Wars, the Critical Conversations podcast. On episode 2, we're going to try to answer the question, does America really love and value diversity, or is that just a fairy tale? Think about it, and let me know if you have any thoughts or comments about it. Don't forget to send me an email at the Race Wars Podcast. And I'll remind you about that. My email address on the Race Wars Podcast is theracewarspodcast@gmail.com. Or send me a DM on my official Instagram account. Follow us at the_race_wars_podcast. Let's talk. I'll be waiting for you. Until next time, much love. And if nobody else is proud of you, I'm proud of you. Thank you so much.